August 7, 1794 was the darkest day of George Washington's presidency. The Whiskey Rebellion, an armed resistance to a federal tax, erupted in western Pennsylvania, and violence was spreading. Washington invoked the Militia Act and personally led 13,000 troops to restore order, many of them veterans of the Revolution. It was the first and only time a sitting president led troops into the field, and it was against U.S. citizens. The darkest day of John Adams' presidency was when he signed the Sedition Act on July 14, 1798. The law made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing about the government. It was passed during an undeclared naval war with France, when Federalists feared foreign influence and domestic unrest. Over the next year, at least 25 people were arrested, most of them newspaper editors or political opponents. Adams was accused of attacking free speech to silence opposition. On December 22, 1807, Thomas Jefferson signed the Embargo Act, halting all American exports in an attempt to pressure Britain and France during the Napoleonic Wars. The law banned nearly all U.S. ships from leaving port. Instead of hurting foreign powers, it devastated the American economy, especially in New England, where shipping, fishing, and trade collapsed. As smuggling became more popular and protests spread, Jefferson authorized aggressive enforcement. He later admitted the law had backfired badly. On August 24, 1814, during the War of 1812, British troops invaded Washington, D.C. They burned the Capitol, the White House, the Treasury, and several other public buildings. President James Madison had already evacuated with his cabinet and spent the night outside the city in a roadside tavern. Government offices were abandoned, official records were lost, and military resistance had collapsed. The British withdrew the next day after carrying out the short attack meant to damage national morale. March 6, 1820 was the day President James Monroe signed the Missouri Compromise into law. It allowed Missouri to join the Union as a slave state and created a boundary across the Western territories where slavery would and wouldn't be allowed. The law gave slavery new federal protection and marked the first time the U.S. drew an official line dividing North and South. Monroe signed it to keep the Union together, but the divide was now law. On March 4, 1824, President John Quincy Adams skipped the inauguration of his successor, Andrew Jackson. 4 years earlier, Adams had won the presidency through a contested House vote, and opponents never accepted his legitimacy. His term ended in isolation, with few allies and no major accomplishments. As Jackson took office, Adams quietly left Washington, having lost the presidency, the confidence of the public, and the support of his own party. Rachel Jackson, Andrew Jackson's wife, passed away from a heart attack on December 22, 1828, just weeks after her husband was elected president. During the campaign, opponents had attacked her past and accused her of adultery for marrying Andrew Jackson before her divorce was finalized. Jackson blamed the public attacks for her declining health. He entered the White House in mourning and wore black throughout his presidency. He never forgave those he believed had contributed to her early passing. On May 10, 1837, banks in New York began suspending payments in gold and silver, triggering a financial panic. Martin Van Buren had taken office just weeks earlier. The collapse spread across the country. Banks and businesses closed. Thousands lost their jobs. With no central bank or federal relief system, Van Buren took no immediate action. The crisis quickly overwhelmed his presidency and dominated the rest of his term. By March 26, 1841, President William Henry Harrison had fallen seriously ill, likely from exposure during his inaugural speech given in cold, wet weather. He had served just 4 weeks and was already too sick to govern. Harrison passed away soon after, becoming the first U.S. president to lose his life in office. His sudden absence triggered the first major test of presidential succession, something the Constitution had never clearly explained. Jonathan Tyler's entire cabinet resigned on September 11, 1841, after he vetoed a bill to create a new national bank. Tyler had taken office unexpectedly after William Henry Harrison's passing, but quickly clashed with the Whig Party that had nominated him. After the veto, Whig leaders abandoned him, and the party expelled him while he was still in office. Tyler finished his presidency without a party and without meaningful support in Congress. On May 11, 1846, President James K. Polk asked Congress to declare war on Mexico, claiming American blood had been shed on American soil. The attack had occurred in disputed territory, and many believed Polk had provoked the war to expand U.S. territory. Congress approved the declaration, but opposition grew quickly. Protests broke out in several cities, and critics in Congress accused Polk of misleading the nation into war. President Zachary Taylor passed away on July 9, 1850, after several days of illness. He had served just 16 months and was the second president to lose his life while in office. His passing came during a national crisis over slavery's expansion into Western territories. Taylor had opposed key parts of the Compromise of 1850. With his replacement, Vice President Millard Fillmore, the direction of national policy immediately changed. On September 18, 1850, President Millard Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law. The bill required citizens in free states to assist in the capture of enslaved people and denied those accused any legal defense. Protests erupted across the North, and enforcement turned violent in some cities. Though Fillmore saw it as a necessity to preserve the Union, the law became one of the most hated in U.S. history. Franklin Pierce witnessed the passing of his only surviving child. Their train derailed outside Boston, and his 11-year-old son was crushed in front of him. Pierce took office weeks later, emotionally shattered. He and his wife viewed the tragedy as divine punishment and struggled with grief throughout his term. The loss cast a shadow over his presidency from the very first day. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina formally seceded from the Union. President James Buchanan remained in the White House but did not act to stop it. By the end of his term, 6 more states would follow. Though he believed secession was illegal, he also claimed he had no constitutional power to intervene. The federal government stood still as the country broke apart, just weeks before Lincoln took office. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after the Civil War effectively ended, President Abraham Lincoln was attacked at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., while watching a play with his wife. The gunman John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box unnoticed and fired a single shot. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house where doctors tried to keep him alive, but he never regained consciousness. On February 24, 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Andrew Johnson. The conflict stemmed from his opposition to Reconstruction and his firing of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Johnson had spent months fighting with Congress over who would control the post-war South. The impeachment left him politically isolated, with almost no support in either party. He narrowly avoided removal in the Senate by a single vote. September 24, 1869, known as Black Friday, was the day financial markets collapsed after a failed attempt by speculators to corner the gold market. The scheme involved 2 of President Ulysses S. Grant's acquaintances, who had tried to use their access to influence policy. Grant eventually ordered the Treasury to act, but the market crashed anyway. The episode led to investigations and damaged public trust in his administration's judgment and independence. On March 5, 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes was publicly inaugurated under military guard. His election had been decided by a special commission after a disputed vote count, and the outcome was part of an informal deal with Southern Democrats. In exchange for the presidency, Hayes agreed to remove federal troops from the South. The decision ended Reconstruction and left millions of Black Americans without federal protection. On July 2, 1881, President James A. Garfield was shot at a Washington train station by a disgruntled office seeker. He had been president for just 4 months. The bullet lodged near his spine, and over the following weeks his condition worsened as doctors probed the wound. Garfield survived the initial shooting but never recovered. He remained bedridden through the summer until passing away in September. On November 17, 1882, Chester A. Arthur received confirmation that he had Bright's disease, a fatal kidney condition. He kept the diagnosis secret from the public while continuing to serve. The disease caused fatigue, weight loss, and pain, and by the end of his presidency, he was physically depleted. Though he rarely spoke of it, the illness quietly shaped how he governed during his remaining time in office. On May 4, 1893, just 2 months into Grover Cleveland's second term, the New York Stock Exchange crashed after the collapse of major railroad companies. The panic spread quickly. Over 500 banks and 15,000 businesses shut down within the year. Unemployment soared and crowds of jobless workers marched in protest. Cleveland opposed federal relief and focused on defending the gold standard. The next year, Democrats lost over 100 seats in Congress. On October 25, 1892, Benjamin Harrison's wife, Caroline, passed away after a long illness. She had served as First Lady throughout his presidency and remained active even as her condition worsened. Harrison suspended his re-election campaign during her final days. Just 2 weeks later, he lost the election to Grover Cleveland. The personal loss and political defeat came in rapid succession, ending his presidency on a somber note. William McKinley was shot by an anarchist while attending a public reception on September 6, 1901, in Buffalo, New York. He had been shaking hands with visitors when the attacker drew a concealed weapon and fired twice at close range. At first, doctors believed the wounds were not life-threatening. But McKinley's condition worsened over the following days. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, vacationing in upstate New York at the time, returned as concerns grew. McKinley never recovered, and Roosevelt was sworn in just over a week later. On October 22, 1907, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed in a wave of panic, setting off a nationwide financial crisis. With no central bank to intervene, Theodore Roosevelt had few tools to stop the crash. Public confidence plunged, and critics blamed his attack on big business for fueling the instability. The panic eased only after J.P. Morgan organized private loans to keep major banks and trusts from falling. On May 17, 1909, just weeks into his presidency, William Howard Taft's wife, Helen, suffered a major stroke during a reception in Washington. She lost her ability to speak and began a long recovery with the help of their daughter. Helen had been Taft's closest political advisor and a driving force behind his campaign. Her sudden illness left Taft shaken and politically isolated early in his presidency. Woodrow Wilson suffered a major stroke on October 2, 1919, after months of exhausting travel promoting the League of Nations. The stroke left him partially paralyzed and unable to fully carry out his duties. For months, his condition was hidden from the public, and his wife Edith took on an unusually active role. With the president incapacitated, major legislation stalled, and the U.S. Senate later rejected the League. Warren G. Harding was in the middle of a national speaking tour when he passed away suddenly at a hotel in San Francisco on August 2, 1923. He had appeared increasingly fatigued in the weeks leading up to the trip. At the time, multiple scandals were unfolding inside his administration, including the Teapot Dome investigation. In the months that followed, several officials were indicted or forced to resign. President Calvin Coolidge's 16-year-old son, Calvin Jr., passed away on July 7, 1924, from a blood infection caused by a small blister. The loss came just days after Coolidge had been nominated to remain in office through the next term. He carried out his duties but became more withdrawn afterward and rarely spoke of the tragedy. Years later, he wrote that the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. U.S. financial markets collapsed on October 29, 1929, in what became known as Black Tuesday. Billions of dollars in value were wiped out in a single day as panic selling overwhelmed the New York Stock Exchange. Banks failed, businesses closed, and layoffs spread across the country. Herbert Hoover urged calm but offered no immediate federal relief. The crash marked the beginning of the Great Depression. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. More than 2,400 Americans lost their lives, and much of the Pacific Fleet was damaged or destroyed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt met with the military and cabinet officials throughout the day. The next morning, he asked Congress for a declaration of war, bringing the United States into World War II. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The blast leveled much of the city and caused tens of thousands of immediate civilian casualties. President Harry S. Truman had approved the use of the weapon days earlier as part of a plan to force Japan's surrender. It was the first time a nuclear weapon had been used in warfare. On May 1, 1960, a U.S. spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory during a covert surveillance mission. President Dwight D. Eisenhower initially denied the purpose of the flight, but the Soviets revealed the captured pilot and plane. The deception caused international embarrassment and led to the collapse of a planned peace summit in Paris. Eisenhower was forced to publicly admit the U.S. had been conducting secret flights over the Soviet Union. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was struck down by gunfire while riding through downtown Dallas in an open motorcade. He was rushed to Parkland Hospital but could not be saved. The motorcade had been part of a political trip ahead of the next election. News of the event spread across the country within minutes, leading to widespread grief, confusion, and fear. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office aboard Air Force One later that afternoon. On January 30, 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a coordinated surprise attack across South Vietnam known as the Tet Offensive. More than 100 cities, towns, and military bases were hit, including the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon. Although U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the attacks, the scale and coordination of the offensive revealed serious failures in American intelligence. The operation directly contradicted White House claims that victory was near and forced the administration to reassess its war strategy. President Richard Nixon announced his resignation in a televised address on August 8, 1974. After months of investigations and mounting pressure over the Watergate scandal, Nixon had lost the support of Congress and his own party, not to mention the American public. He submitted his resignation letter the following morning, becoming the first U.S. president to leave office voluntarily. Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in later that day. Just 1 month into his presidency, Gerald Ford issued a full pardon to Richard Nixon on September 8, 1974. The decision was unexpected and led to a sharp drop in Ford's approval ratings, from 71 to 49% in less than a week. Many suspected the pardon was part of a secret deal, though no evidence ever confirmed it. Ford later testified before Congress to defend his decision. Jimmy Carter approved a military mission to rescue 52 Americans held hostage in Iran. On April 24, 1980, the operation was aborted in the desert after multiple equipment failures. During the withdrawal, a helicopter collided with a transport aircraft. 8 U.S. service members lost their lives. The mission was publicly acknowledged that evening, and Carter addressed the nation from the White House, accepting full responsibility for the failed rescue attempt. On October 23, 1983, a truck packed with explosives drove into a U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, and detonated. The blast destroyed the building and resulted in the loss of 241 American service members. President Ronald Reagan had deployed troops as part of an international peacekeeping force. Following the attack, additional security measures were ordered, and Reagan began reviewing plans to scale back the American presence in Lebanon. On November 3, 1992, President George H.W. Bush lost his re-election bid to Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. The result ended 12 consecutive years of Republican control of the White House. Bush had entered office with high approval following the Gulf War, but rising unemployment and a stalled economy led to widespread voter dissatisfaction. He became the first sitting president since Jimmy Carter to be denied a second term. On December 19, 1998, the House of Representatives approved 2 articles of impeachment against President Bill Clinton. The charges stemmed from his sworn testimony about an inappropriate relationship with a White House intern. The vote made Clinton the second president in U.S. history to be impeached. That evening, he addressed the nation from the White House, stating he would remain in office and continue to carry out his duties. Hijacked planes struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on the morning of September 11, 2001. A 4th plane crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers intervened. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. President George W. Bush was quickly moved to secure locations as the scale of the attacks became clear. He returned to Washington that evening and addressed the nation from the Oval Office for the first time during his presidency. On December 14, 2012, a gunman entered Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newton, Connecticut, and opened fire in a first-grade classroom. 20 children and 6 school staff members lost their lives. The attack on December 14, 2012 was during President Barack Obama's second term. The attack was one of the deadliest shootings in U.S. history. That day, multiple states implemented emergency lockdowns, and security was increased at schools and public buildings across the country. During President Donald Trump's final weeks in office, a crowd entered the U.S. Capitol as Congress met to certify the results of the 2020 election. Lawmakers were evacuated, the session was suspended, and offices were damaged. The Senate chamber was briefly occupied. One person lost their life after being shot outside the House chamber. The Capitol was secured by evening, and Congress reconvened under National Guard protection to complete the certification. On August 26, 2021, an explosive device detonated outside Kabul's airport during the final days of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. The blast resulted in the loss of 13 American service members and more than 170 Afghan civilians. President Joe Biden had ordered a full withdrawal earlier that year. Evacuations continued under heightened security, but thousands remained unable to leave before the final military flights departed days later. Thank you for watching the video and making it to the end. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure there are some dark days that you may have a disagreement about, so please let us know those in the comments below. And if you'd like to see more about American presidents, click on the video on the screen. Thanks again. See you next time.